In this week's video, we're doing Judy's magic cast on. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. This is the third video in a series on cast on methods that can be used either as a provisional cast on or as a closed cast on, like the sort you'd need for starting a toe-up sock. Today I'll be demonstrating only the closed version of Judy's magic cast on. I'll demonstrate it as a provisional cast on next week. So a little background information on this cast on. Judy's magic cast on was created and originally described by Judy Becker in the spring 2006 issue of Knitting Magazine. Her goal was to improve toe-up socks by solving the tension issues that first row of the figure 8 cast on has that we saw in last week's video. In her original version, the stitches of the magic cast on sat on the needles in the same orientation as the figure 8 cast on, so that the stitches on one of the needles had to be worked through the back in order not to become twisted as they came off the needles. That issue was resolved by Kat Bordy, who showed us how to wrap the loops so that all the stitches sat on the needles in the same orientation. There are a couple of ways that an individual knitter might vary this cast on, such as not using a slip knot or placing the first loop on the lower needle rather than the upper needle, or whether they hang the yarn tail over the front of their thumb or over the back of their index finger. None of these variations fundamentally change the results of the cast on. There's simply another way to get to the same endpoint. So having said all that, let's get started on Judy's magic cast on. For Judy's magic cast on, we're going to use 2 strands of yarn like you would for a long tail cast on. And I'm going to do this cast on using 1 long circular needle. You can use the 2 circulars method if you prefer, but I'll be demonstrating with 1 circular needle. So you need to measure off a tail, and the amount of tail you need is based on how wide the cast on will be. So typically for a closed cast on, you just have a couple of inches. So if you were doing 2 inches, you would need 6 inches of tail plus another 6 inches of tail for weaving in. So if you're doing a toe-up sock, it's really usually only 1.5 inches or 2 inches. So a 12 inches worth of yarn is plenty. Now I bring the yarn tail over the front of my thumb and the working yarn comes over my index finger in the back. So I'm tensioning this the same way I would do it for a long tail cast on. So I want this tail to be about 1 foot long here. So I have it just resting over the 2 fingers, and then I clasp the strands against my palm. I don't need to give it a death grip, just holding them there. So here you see I have my thumb is lower, it's the lower finger, and I have my index finger is up. So we've got lower finger, upper finger. We're going to hold the 2 needles parallel to each other, pointing to the left. And you have a lower needle and an upper needle as well. So you can use a slip knot. I prefer not to use a slip knot if I can avoid it. So the first stitch on the needle is simply going to be made by inserting the yarn between the 2 needles. So that's the first stitch, and it's on the lower needle. So every time we put a stitch on the lower needle, we need a matching one on the upper needle. Now we have these 2 strands of yarn. One is upper and one is lower. We're going to use the lower strand to produce the loops on the upper needle and the upper strand to produce the loops on the lower needle. And we're going to wrap them around the bottom of a needle and over the top. So I need a loop on the upper needle. I'm going to use this lower strand. I'm going to bring it up between the 2 needles and then over the top. So you can see how now I've got 2 needles or 2 loops on the needles. So now I need to place one on the lower needle. I'm going to use the upper strand, and I will use my thumb to keep things in place if I need to. So this upper strand has to come around the bottom of the lower needle and then between these 2 needles. So you're always coming around the front from the bottom over the top. Now I need the lower one to go around the upper needle. Again, I'm going to put my thumb here to hold them in place. So it has to come between the needles and over the top. So now the upper strand comes around the bottom needle and ends up between the two. The lower one comes between the two and over the top. The upper yarn around the lower needle, the lower yarn around the upper needle. And you just keep alternating. So now I've got 4 on each needle. 5, 5, 6, 6. And my hand is twisting in order to manage to get the yarn over each needle. You can move your needle tips or you can move your fingers to get the yarn around each needle. Let's see how many I have now. 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 9, 10, 10. So now I have 10 stitches on the needle. Now I want to rotate them so that the needles point to the right. And I want to look at the back. I want to make sure that these 2 strands cross each other one last time. That's the yarn tail is this one. So I want to make sure that one crosses over. I'm going to hold on to the working end and get this tail out of the way. So they cross over one last time. Now the 2 needles are pointed to the right. I'm going to hold this tail out of the way. We're going to work across the top stitches and then across the bottom stitches. So we do that by pulling this lower needle out of the lower stitches so that they're resting on the cable. Now we're going to knit across all of these stitches. But before we do this, I want to just want to point out that on the back, when the cast on is complete, you'll see that between the 2 needles, you'll see this row of purl bumps. So that distinguishes this cast on from other cast ons. It's essentially you've created full stitches on the needle and you have this shared row of purl bumps. So now we're going to knit across this first row. After we have knit across one needle, you'll see that we actually have a full row of stitches between the 2 needles. Okay, so now we want to knit across the other needle. We want to rotate so that the needle is pointing to the right. Now we can pull on the cable that was holding those resting stitches and get them onto the needle. We have the working yarn end here. Now we pull out the bottom needle so that we can knit across these stitches. So now we've completed one full round working across the stitches on each of the needles, and now we have 2 full rows of stitches between each of the 2 needles, where with the Turkish cast on and figure 8 cast on, this is the point when we would have only had 1 row of stitches. So to continue working in the round, you once again rotate the needles so that they're pointing to the right and bring the resting stitches up onto a needle. And the lower stitches, let them sit on the cable here. And this is the point when you're working in the round where you're going to be increasing at each end of each needle as you're working in the round. So here's an example of Judy's magic cast on worked for about 6 rounds. I think there's 12 rows from one end, cast on end to the other, so that would be 6 rounds. And you can see that the tension is excellent on this side. So it really does resolve the problems of the figure 8 cast on. And you can see that the back side looks just as good. There's no gutters between any of the rows. So the main difference between Judy's magic cast on and the figure 8 and Turkish cast ons is that when you use Judy's magic cast on and complete the first round of knitting, you have 2 rows of stitches between the needles rather than just a single row. It's unlikely that this will make any sort of difference in the finished project. Judy's magic cast on feels a little more stable than the Turkish cast on because you have actual stitches surrounding each needle, and it resolves the tension issues of the figure 8 cast on. But it's also a lot more challenging cast on to execute. There are trade-offs. So next week, we'll look at how to use Judy's Magic Cast-On as a provisional cast-on. It behaves a bit differently than any other provisional cast-on, and those differences bring with it some advantages and disadvantages. If you have any comments or questions about this week's video or suggestions about videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Roxanne. There's a link to that down in the description box. To see all the videos in this series, you can click on the playlist up here. To subscribe to my channel, you can click on my face over here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.